Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bryce Duskin. On this episode, Doug Simon discusses corn and soybean markets. Keith Glewen talks about the Field Crop Scout training. Tony Adesemoye explains soilborne pathogens. And Tamra Jackson-Ziems shares information on seedling diseases that could affect Nebraska corn production. Doug Simon from Tredas is our market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture released the May World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates last week. World stocks were closely watched as the USDA increased soybean totals for old crop by 50 million bushels. The report suggests new crop ending stocks for soybeans will drop by 4.5% year over year. As we record this week's show on Thursday morning, China and the U.S. are still having trade discussions. For the second round of discussions, they're currently in Washington, D.C. On the other hand, the world corn stocks for old crop ended nearly 1.5% lower than the USDA April estimates. World new crop corn ending stocks are projected to fall 19.5% over a year ago. We spoke with Doug Tuesday afternoon and began by asking him about these WASDE numbers.
This is the first time USDA puts together acres from the March 30th planting intentions and then also the yields, and then they throw together all the supply and the demand, the use numbers for next year. And it was a really interesting report. Actually, the soybean carryovers came in at 415 million bushels, and the big surprise was that they actually increased the exports for soybeans versus last year by 225 million bushels. And with all the trade war talk that's going on, it's interesting to see that USDA was that confident to boost those exports. The U.S. Adesemoye had some high numbers earlier on exports, or it'd be imports by China, and so maybe they're getting a little bit more confidence from that. When you look on the corn side of it, the acres were at 88 million acres, and we had known that number, the yields at 174, but on the use side, they actually boosted the ethanol side of it, again, which is encouraging, but they cut feed use and they cut the export use there. So the actual corn carryover number at 1.7 billion bushels was a little bit below that. Came in just a touch above the trade expectations, but on the soybean side, that 415 million bushels was on the lower end of the expectations. They were looking anywhere from 375 million bushels up to over 700 million bushels. So that 415 million bushel number was encouraging. It really cut down the carryovers on the beans.
USDA also released their price projections for this 2018-2019 crop. Any surprises in those numbers?
Well, it's always interesting to look at what they're using. When you look at last year's numbers, they were using a $3 to $3.80 average price on the corn side of it. The bean side, they were $8.30 to $10.30, so they had a $2 range on the beans. This year, they boosted that floor on the corn to $3.30, and then the upper end of the range is $4.30, so they've got a $1 range there. And this is an early estimate. It'll be much more accurate when we get out towards September, obviously. And on the bean side, they're $8.75 to $11.25. So that floor has been boosted because of that tighter U.S. stocks numbers at 1.7 versus a number last year that was 2.2 billion, and earlier season estimates were up towards 2.5 billion. So those numbers are much more attractive, and the bean carryover at 415 versus last year number in that 500 to 520 million bushel range. Those numbers are tighter, and it's given us more encouraging prices.
Following the WASDE report, how did the markets react? We're always watching those.
Well, the beans came out of the gate because of that drop and that big bump in the exports, and came up. They were jumped up quite a bit. But now, when you look into this week, today, bean prices are back in that. What did they end up? 10.22 on Tuesday. Our recent high has been up toward 1060. So even with that encouraging news, our carryovers aren't, they're tighter, but our prices aren't back up to those highs we put in earlier. Beans today were up a nickel, and they finished at almost 420 on the day. Our recent highs on there have been 424. So actually, the corn is actually not too far off its recent highs, which is encouraging.
USDA released their crop progress report on Monday, and farmers are now making up some of they were once behind a little bit, but they're making up that pretty quickly. What are we watching now as it comes to crop progress?
Well, it seems like those numbers have been lagging the last couple weeks versus when we talk to the people we work with. Nebraska corn farmers are pretty much done planting corn. Beans are really finishing up too. Last week they said 62% or on Monday was planted versus 69% last year. The bean side of it, 35% planted, which actually 29% last year, so we're ahead of pace on the beans. There's more farmers trying to plant beans earlier, thinking they'll get some yield advantage of that. The places where we're lagging, South Dakota's 40 points behind what they were normally. Minnesota is about 25 points behind their normal pace. Iowa's about 5 points behind their pace. So that South Dakota border area into into Iowa and Minnesota is wet, and that's where they're behind. But I think that over time they're going to get that planted.
There always seems to be volatility in the marketplace. As we wrap up here, how do we manage some of that volatility?
Well, we look at our crop insurance guarantees, and that's a value that we want to try to sell year in and year out. That's why that crop insurance guarantee is there, to give us some encouragement to sell. And so we want to go out. Corn is, for example, we'd like to be about 60% of that seasonal average sold. So if somebody's going to raise 100,000 bushels of corn and they've got 70% crop insurance guarantee, that'd have about 60% of that sold. So that's about 40 to 50,000 bushels sold. Now, you can, going forward from here, which we think you still need to be selling those increments over time, you want to look at maybe doing something with some puts, or if you hedge, buy some calls, or if you do a hedge derived, keep some flexibility in there. We always kind of look at keeping some calls as a part of our portfolio in case we do have some type of weather. And that's one of the things, is that we have warmer conditions down south, and it's been drier relative to where, if you look at that drought monitor. So I think we're set up in a situation with those tighter acres, those smaller acres, tighter world stocks, tighter U.S. stocks, that we could have some more weather volatility. But we still want to stay. Our plan is to continue to sell increments. Bob Wisner, famous Iowa State economist, says, sell your corn when you're putting it into the planter box. So it's that time of the year to be selling corn and soybeans.
Next week, Elaine Cubb, author of Mastering the Grain Markets, will join us to provide her analysis of corn and soybean markets. A recent Nebraska Extension training program educated agriculture workers and producers to better manage corn and soybeans. According to Keith Glewen, Nebraska Extension educator, the Field Crop Scout training began in the mid-1990s because of a demand for entry-level education in crop production. The program includes topics such as insect and weed scouting, crop diseases, and the growth and development stages in corn and soybeans. We spoke with Keith at the training and began by asking him about the different groups of attendees.
We realized after a few years we had two audiences, and one was the individuals who manage co-ops, manage farm service centers, who make the decisions on the control of pests. And our second audience was their employees during the summer months, who most often were students at the university or high school graduates who were working for these managers. And they were living with mom and dad because of free room and board, and they needed to make a little money for expenses the following school year. But they didn't have a lot of knowledge or background as far as what goes on in the corn and soybean field. In fact, I polled the audience this morning, and about a fourth of our audience has taken a class in Agronomy 101, if you would. And so we probably got a lot of psychology and history majors in class, but they need to know what's going on in the cornfield. And one of the most important things is they need to effectively communicate what they're seeing and experiencing in the corn and soybean fields. And so we provide this introductory level training, and they get to go home with a great offering of resource materials that they can go back on and look up and confirm what they heard and saw in the training.
At the training, corn and soybean growers are able to learn how to improve their overall yield production. From scouting insects and identifying weeds to simply understanding the growth and development of corn and soybeans, growers are able to make better management decisions based on specific growth stages.
When I say knee-high corn, your knees are a different level than my knees. And so we know that if we apply certain weed control products, certain fungicides, at the wrong stage of growth, it can have an important effect on final yield, and in some cases adverse effect. And so it's very important that they know what they're seeing and how to communicate it to the person that's going to decide what to apply as far as a pest control product. And so we cover the growth of corn, for example. We spend a lot of time on corn because corn is very complex in nature compared to maybe soybeans, although some would argue that soybeans are a complex plant, and they are in a sense. But we talk about the vegetative growth stages and how to identify those stages, and then how management decisions can influence yield even in those vegetative stages of growth. And then of course we get into reproductive stages of growth, and those can be very important as well based on final yield. And we talk about how the scout needs to know the difference between the R1 stage of growth and the R4 stage of growth, and communicate that effectively to their managers. We talk about growing degree days and how in corn plant, the development of that corn plant is based on primarily temperature and growing degree days, and how in soybean production that isn't as important.
Soybeans may not be as complex as corn, but they also require specific management requirements during their growth and development.
Well, soybeans, of course, are a legume or a dicot, and grass is a grass or monocot. And soybeans, although temperature does to some extent influence their development, is to a much lesser extent than with corn. And so we talk about the importance of the different vegetative stages of growth, and how the soybean plant grows and develops differently than the corn plant. It has a somewhat of a taproot system, whereas corn is a fibrous root system. And we talk about how to identify those different vegetative stages. And in corn, we're talking about the collar method, sort of like the collar on your shirt. When that leaf is fully extended, then there's a collar on the stalk, if you would, that surrounds the leaf. And that's when we designate it as a leaf stage. So V3 corn, you've got 3 leaves that have a collar around it. With soybeans, we're talking about the cotyledons, where we talk about emergence, and then we get into the unifoliate leaves, the next stage of development with the soybean plant. And then from there on, we're talking about trifoliates, where we have 3 leaflets, okay? And we talk about what happens if we have hail damage, or what happens if we scorch the plant with a herbicide, for example, or we have insect damage, how that influences the development and subsequent final yield of that soybean, as well as the corn plant. And so soybeans have vegetative growth stages and reproductive stages simultaneously. So when we get to the R1 stage of growth on a soybean plant, which is flowering, we can also have the additional vegetative stages developing on the plant at the same time. And with soybeans, we talk about how important that R3 growth stage is, where we have a pod on the upper 4 nodes of the plant that's 3/16 of an inch in size, and how the soybean plant at that time needs to be really happy for outstanding yields. And by defining happiness, I mean it has adequate water, soil moisture, and nutrients, as well as sunlight, of course, which we don't have a lot of control over.
Next week, Justin McMecken, Nebraska Extension Cropping System Specialist, will discuss early insect scouting and management decisions. Much of the state saw cool weather conditions this spring and a delay in early planting. Tony Adesemoye, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist, says these factors can lead to the development of seedling pathogens. The pathogens can result in seeds that are unable to germinate or emerge from the ground. Tony notes that once symptoms are recognized, there is little to nothing that can be done to control the disease. We recently spoke with Tony about the seedling pathogens and the potential impact in the field.
Soilborne pathogens can cause yield losses. When you have conditions that are favorable to those pathogens and you have your seed planted, the seed may not germinate or emerge. And when they emerge, the pathogen may still attack them, and so they may be killed or they are stunted. And so the combination of that can lead to poor stand establishment. You can have poor vigor of the seedling, and all those may lead into yield losses.
Because soil-borne pathogens lead to yield loss, it is important to be able to identify the different types of pathogens.
There are many potential pathogens that could be favored by those conditions. Examples of those are Fusarium, you have Rhizoctonia, and even when the moisture is high and the soil is saturated, you could have pathogens like Pythium, you could have pathogens like Phytophthora in soybean.
Due to the recent cold spring conditions, it can be difficult for seedlings to emerge. If the seedlings are unable to emerge, there is a high chance that soil-borne pathogens will evolve and cause pre-emergence dampening off.
There are many symptoms that you can see in the field that will make you to suspect. For example, you may have root rot, you may have damping up, as I mentioned. Sometimes you have very pure vigor of the seedling. You may have pure stand establishment. You may have some locations where you see that the seedlings are drying up or they are killed, or you have small vacant locations in your field that there are no seedlings emerging. Sometimes, though, some of the symptoms that you see, you won't be able to tell. And so we encourage producers, when you see things that are strange in your field, that you are not sure, it might be better for you to collect those samples and send to the plant diagnostic clinic in Lincoln, and the clinic will be able to help to tell you. If you have crop consultants or you have people working with you, you may also be better to ask them for questions about what you are seeing in your field. And extension educators and our specialists also will be able to help.
In order to decrease the chances of soil-borne pathogens, it is important to follow specific crop management steps during the cold and wet planting seasons.
And so planting resistant varieties, planting fungicide-treated seed, rotation of crops. So if you find out that in a location last year that there are soil-borne pathogens, that information is quite good, because this year you can then rotate with crops that will not be susceptible to those pathogens. So seeking the advice of professionals will be very helpful in a situation like that. But what is even more important is for you to integrate multiple strategies. So one strategy is not enough, but use multiple strategies, integrate them together, and that will help you to be able to manage your soil-borne pathogens.
You can learn more about soil-borne pathogens by reading Tony's CropWatch article at cropwatch.unl.edu. Solid-stemmed wheat varieties may give western Nebraska growers an option to prevent yield and harvest losses caused by wheat stem sawfly. After wheat stem sawfly lay eggs in the stem, larvae cut and weaken the stems, resulting in lodging. A solid stem doesn't give sawflies room to grow after their eggs hatch, and in some cases, crush the eggs before they can hatch. However, most solid stem varieties are bred and adapted for northern plains locations like Montana. Researchers at the University of Nebraska's Panhandle Research and Extension Center have tested the yield potential of these varieties over the last few years. You can read about the potential for solid stem wheat in the May Nebraska Farmer. According to Tamra Jackson-Ziems, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist, seedling diseases are being reported in the Kansas corn crop. Seedling diseases can infect the plant and cause seed rot or kill a plant altogether. Symptoms of seedling diseases include poor stand establishment or skips in the rows. We sat down with Tamra at a recent Nebraska Extension training program to learn more about the symptoms and ways to avoid seedling diseases.
Well, we're beginning to get reports out of Kansas that seedling diseases are occurring down there in corn, and so it would be a good reminder to remind all of our producers and crop consultants in Nebraska that we do have a lot of seedling diseases that are possible, and we've had some problems with them over the last several years. When we start to see seedling diseases, it's usually after we've had some kind of inclement weather conditions or any conditions that are not that favorable for rapid corn emergence and germination. And so anything that delays that, whether maybe those seed were planted into cold soil or maybe we got a lot of rain and had some ponding and wet conditions. And in particular, wet conditions are going to be more favorable for seedling diseases. And so those fields where you may have some ponding or you may have soil types that hold water for longer, they may be at higher risk for some of these diseases, and I would definitely keep an eye on those fields.
We further asked Tamra about the symptoms these seedling diseases cause.
Seedling diseases can affect plants in a lot of different ways. They may infect plants and actually cause a seed rot before the seed germinate. They can actually kill the plant itself, though, either before or after it emerges. And so when you're out checking fields and you don't see very good stand establishment, or you see skips or gaps between healthy plants, it would be worth the time to dig down through there to find out exactly what happened to that seedling, whether it may have been affected by a seedling disease or another problem. And then, of course, to calculate how much of a stand you've got and whether or not you might need a replant.
While checking a field for seedling diseases, it could be difficult to identify which disease is causing the damage.
Some of our most common seedling diseases in corn are caused by Pythium, and that's a fungal-like organism. That organism has to have moisture, and so that's the one that's been most common for us during the last 2 or 3 years where we've had wetter conditions. And so ponding is especially going to be favorable for that. And there are species of Pythium that are favored by either cool or warm conditions. In addition to Pythium, though, other common diseases may be caused by Fusarium or Rhizoctonia. And so any of these are possible in the soils around Nebraska. And it's difficult to tell them apart for any one. And even though there are some symptoms that you might recognize, the easiest way maybe is to just get a sample submitted to the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic to find out what that is.
When it comes to managing seedling diseases, it is important to pay attention to soil temperature and the amount of moisture obtained during the planting season.
Managing seedling diseases can be a challenge, and so as we try to plant more and more acres and we push the planting date, we're planting into soils that might be cooler or wetter, and we need to keep that in mind. So if you know you have a field or fields that are more prone to having seedling diseases, even waiting another few days to plant that, or waiting until last to plant some of those higher pressure fields, might give you an advantage and give those plants a chance to grow and emerge before those pathogens infect them. In corn, since most of our corn is already treated with seed treatment fungicides, we don't always have an opportunity to make decisions about adding a product there, but just by manipulating planting date, we can sometimes help that. And in some fields where we've got a drainage problem, sometimes tiling may help too.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast, and of course I've been gone for the last 2 weeks, so I'd like to thank Martha for subbing in for me last week. As we go forward in time, we're looking at a storm system moving into the Central Plains. That's been impacting us the last couple of days, and will continue through this weekend. But more importantly, the precipitation that's come out of this event is very welcome, simply because if we look over the last couple of weeks, there's been many locations in the state that have received less than an inch of precipitation. Typically, we would expect to receive at least an inch of moisture a week. And then there are some areas in north central and northeast Nebraska that have had a little bit too much of a good thing, and we continue to see some issues in terms of getting out in the fields and getting the crops planted in a timely fashion. So overall, kind of a mixed message here, but it does look pretty promising for those areas of the state that have not received significant moisture to at least have several more opportunities during this next 7-day period. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store. And as we go to the upper air models, we have a very, very weak trough in the western United States that is slowly making its way toward the east. The main jet is well to our north, so not a lot of energy pushing the system out. So we have a surface low just to the southeast of Nebraska. That's pumping up Gulf moisture and a high pressure coming in from the northern plains. And that convergence zone lies right over Nebraska. We expect thunderstorms to fire up today with some potentially heavy. And as we go into tomorrow, that wave tries to lift out a little bit. It's a little weaker. That low moves slightly to our east, more toward southeastern Iowa. There's still going to be quite a bit of moisture to wrap around this, and it looks primarily it's going to impact more of eastern Nebraska and all of Iowa. And this probably will occur during the first half of the day. And then that trough starts to lift toward the Great Lakes on Monday. We see surface lows to our south, but with that high pressure moving into our region, the return flow around that high pressure system will not be significant enough to generate much in the way of active precipitation. Most of the main precipitation will move to the east of us. And then as we get into Tuesday, we get a trough carving out in the Great Lakes. We have another trough trying to form in the west, and we have a series of low pressure systems indicated at the surface. And that should help to pump up a little bit of moisture, and we'll start to see a convergence storm or a warm front start to lift into our region. So we start to see some precipitation, particularly across southern Nebraska. And that upper air low tends to strengthen slightly over the western United States, kind of stationary. We'll see some surface lows forming in the high plains region, and that's going to, again, move some moisture up. So we have another excellent opportunity for precipitation statewide as we go into Wednesday before we start to see that trough kind of losing some of its potential and moving toward the northeast. That will still leave a surface low in southwestern Kansas that will leave enough moisture coming to the north to generate thunderstorms during the main heating of the afternoon, but the primary focus of precipitation will be over the northern plains and northern Rockies. And then by Friday, this trough starts to make its way toward the Great Lakes. We still show a surface low down to our south. This might be overplayed somewhat, but the moisture feed to the north of us should really enhance the precipitation over the northern plains and maybe some light shower activity over the eastern part of the state. Now, if we take a little farther look, 8 to 14-day forecast, warm conditions across the entire country from next Thursday to the following Tuesday. And in terms of precipitation, we see that precipitation shield switching off to the Great Lakes region with drier conditions indicated for the southern plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, entry-level field crop scout training, soil-borne seedling pathogens, and seedling diseases. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Elaine Cubb, author of Mastering the Grain Markets, will be our corn and soybean market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bryce Duskin.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.